So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled 20th Century Fiction, where we're looking at Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway. So we've had already a lecture on this, and we talked about some of the themes that are the overarching themes of this particular novel. And this is obviously a post-First World War novel. It occupies one day in London. And the references to war are very obliquely done, so there are not direct graphic references to the war, but the effect of the war is very much there. It's some kind of a spectral presence across London, across the metropolis. So the war is there as some kind of a reminder. There's always this reminders of war, the references to war, which are made sometimes very indirectly, sometimes offhand. But the indirectness and the offhand quality is exactly what makes the entire spectrality of war very, very menacing. So superficially, this is about Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa Dalloway, trying to throw a party at a London home. And the whole day is a preparation for the party that she's making. And there's also the other character, Septimus Smith, who is the war veteran who's come back to London after the war, and who finds himself completely abandoned and alienated in a post-war metropolis. Now let's take a look at this section, which should be on your screen, where the references to war are made very obliquely, very complexly. I mean, there's a sense that the novel is trying very hard, the narrative is trying very hard to tell us that the war is over, everything is behind us. But at the same time, the residual violence of the war is very much there. And there's a degree of denial about the losses the war had created historically. So this should be on your screen. For it was the middle of June, the war was over, except for someone like Mrs. Foxcroft at the embassy last night, eating a hard hour because the nice boy was killed and now the old manor house must go to her cousin. So again, look at the way in which even the losses out of the war are made into some kind of a banal thing, right? So because someone has been killed, some property will go to someone else. So the banality of violence is something which has been described to us, the hypocrisy of the upper middle class Londoners over here. Or Lady Bexborough, who opened a bazaar, they said, with a telegram in her hand, John, her favourite, killed. But it was over, thank heaven, over. It was June. The king and the queen were at the palace, and everywhere, though it was still so early, there was a beating, a stirring of galloping ponies, tapping of cricket bats, lords, Ascot, Ranelagh, and all the rest of it, wrapped up in a soft mesh of the grey-blue morning air, which, as the day wore on, would unwind them, and set down on the lawns and pitches the bouncing ponies, whose forefeet just struck the ground, and up they sprang, the whirling young men, the laughing girls in the transparent muslins, who even now, after dancing all night, were taking the absurd woolly dogs for a run. And even now at this hour, discreet old doggers were shooting out in the motor cars on errands of mystery, and the shopkeepers were fidgeting in the windows with their paste and diamonds, the lovely old sea green brooches in 18th century settings to tempt Americans. But one must economize, not buy things rashly for Elizabeth. And she too, loving it as she did with an absurd and faithful passion, being part of it since the people were counters, courtiers once in the time of the Georges. She too was going that very night to kindle and illuminate, to give a party. But how strange, on entering the park, the silence, the mist, the hum, the slow swimming happy ducks, the pouched birds waddling, and who should be coming along with his back against the government buildings, most appropriately carrying a dispatch box stamped with the royal arms, who but Hugh Whitbread, our old friend Hugh, the admirable Hugh. So the entire passage is full of very happy images of which carry a lot of life in them, vitality, lifelike qualities. But there's also this tension that you can see very, very clearly, that it's trying very hard to look happy, it's trying very hard to look very vital, and it's almost like having a party every day. There is this compulsive condition which is very thinly disguised in this particular passage. I mean, trying to come out of the war, trying to move on from the war, as it were. And this compulsion to move on from the war is exactly which contains the trauma of the war. The fact that it's not been confronted with, the fact that it's not been talked about. The war is over as some kind of a temporal thing. It was a thing of the past. Some people have lost their lives, but then even those losses are mediated through some markers of banality, like property, the repossession of property by someone who's not supposed to possess it, etc. So all these markers are given to us in just to sort of banalize the whole thing. And there's this constant references to people having parties, people being happy, etc. Okay, so and that's something which we should be paying some attention to in terms of looking at the spectrality of war and Mrs. Dalloway. Okay. Okay, so we have the reference to Peter Walsh, who was a former lover of Clarissa Dalloway, and we are told that Peter's come back from the colonies, he's come back from India. India, of course, being a British colony at that time, and he had married some Indian woman there, presumably some Anglo-Indian woman, and that's something which is looked down upon by Clarissa Dalloway. It's like Peter marrying someone who's racially different, and that disregard, the disgust that Clarissa Dalloway has is very important for us to notice, because that is the typical white metropolitan disgust towards people of mixed races in the colonies. So even though the Anglo-Indians are ethnically British or ethnically white, because they have been quote-unquote polluted with the mixing of another race, the sexual miscegenation that they've had, that makes them something to be looked down upon, and that's something that Clarissa Dalloway is exhibiting. That disgust is precisely because of the racial miscegenation that is embodied by the Anglo-Indians. And this is a very unflattering depiction of Indian woman, Anglo-Indian woman. But those Indian women did presumably silly, pretty, flimsy, non-com pubes, and she wasted her pity, for he was quite happy, he assured her, perfectly happy, though he had never done a thing that it talked of. His whole life had been a failure. It made her angry still. So Peter Walsh over here, he embodies a very important symptom over here, a symptom of decadence, a symptom of tiredness. And he too, he comes back to London and doesn't quite understand the city, because he had left London many years ago and he's spent his time in the colonies, and now he feels a bit alienated. So you have different kinds, different experiences of alienation in Mrs. Dalloway. There's Septimus Smith, of course, who comes back from the war and feels completely disconnected from the metropolis. There's Peter Walsh, who comes back from the colonies and cannot quite connect to the vitality of London life. And of course, there's Clarissa Dalloway, who feels alienated because of her gender, because of her seeming sort of insularity with the goings on around him. Okay, so that's something that is important for us to understand. Okay, and now we have a reference to Bond Street. There's this commercial place in London where you have all these high-end shops, and we talked about, we see how Bond Street is mentioned as this very fascinating, happy space. So again, we have this very compulsive consumerism which is coming out from the war, and that compulsive consumerism was compulsive compulsion to sort of, consumed by buying things, by trading parties, etc., is part of the denial package, part of the denial narrative that is sort of described and dramatized in Mrs. Dalloway. So it's like a conspicuous consumption of different things right after the war, just to prove, to hammer home the point that we have moved on from the war, and that that actually accentuates the spectrality of the war, that makes the war a more present thing, a more present phenomenon, which is always there, the backdrop of this narrative. So we're told that Bond Street fascinated her. Bond Street, early in the morning in the season, there's flags flying, there's shops, no splash, no glitter, one roll of tweed in the shop where her father had bought his suits for 50 years, a few pearls, salmon on the ice bag. That is all, she said, looking at the fishmongers, that is all. She repeated, pausing for a moment at the window of a glove shop, where before the war you could buy almost perfect gloves. And these are the little touches in Mrs. Dalloway which make it such an interesting and complex novels. The fact that we are told that before the war, from this particular shop, you can make almost perfect gloves. The obvious implication is post-war it is not so perfect anymore. The gloves are not so perfect anymore. The gloves are a bit, disfigured. The gloves are a bit misshapen, and there can be all kinds of readings out of it. One of the readings, obviously, is people come back from the war. The veterans who come back from the war, sometimes they had missing fingers, so maybe the gloves had to be made differently, had to be designed differently post-war. So the perfection of the gloves before the war is being contrasted with the imperfection, and the imperfection, of course, could be a medical, a cosmetic compulsion after the war because of the sufferings, the physical sufferings that the war had caused to people. Okay, and our old uncle William used to say that a lady is known by her shoes and her gloves. He had turned on his bed one morning in the middle of the war. He had said, "I have had enough, gloves and shoes." She had a passion for gloves, but her own daughter Elizabeth could care not a straw for either of them. So we have this generation gap which is beginning to be dramatized over here. So Elizabeth Dalloway, who is obviously the daughter of Clarissa Dalloway, seems to be very different from her mother. She doesn't care for the things that her mother had cared for. She didn't care for gloves, she didn't care for shoes, which is something that she had always been fascinated with. Okay, and then we are told how the war, which was obviously fought in a more macro space, had its extensions and spillovers in more domestic, more intimate spaces. And then, there's a description over here which is interesting. Her dismissal from school during the war, poor, embittered, unfortunate creature. This has been, we're talking about someone called Miss Kilman, who was obviously a story figure. For it was not her one hated, but the idea of her, which undoubtedly had gathered into herself a great deal, that was not Miss Kilman, had become one of the spectres with which one battles in the night. One of the spectres who stand astride for us and suck up half our lifeblood, dominators and tyrants. For no doubt, with another throw of the dice, had the black been uppermost and not the white, should have loved Miss Kilman. But in this world, no. So again, the whole idea of Miss Kilman being this other woman, or racially other, symbolically other, culturally other, and she's universally detested because of the cultural conditions around London at that particular point of time. And that spirituality of the war is very much there, and that spirituality of the war, it further accentuates racism, it further accentuates cultural othering, it further accentuates xenophobia, because the war had created such a lot of trauma, such a lot of violence in the minds of people, and that obviously generates a xenophobia which is very, very palpably present in Mrs. Dalloway. Okay, now the next section is interesting because till now we've seen a series of very tranquil, abundant images of flowers and jams and lovely shops in Bond Street, and everything seems to be very tranquil and seamlessly beautiful, and everything seems to be very functional as well in this metropolis. And the word is just a historical reference. It's something which happened temporarily at some point in the past. But there's no point, till this point, there's no reference to the war having created any difference in a cognitive system, any difference in the way people perceive and cognize things. And then we have an example of this, how a simple accident, a simple sound in the street can actually shock people because of the constant fear of bombardment, the constant fear of being attacked by bombs, and how that is sort of eaten into the nervous system. So any sound which will create a start now, any sound will create a traumatic trigger now, a déjà vu now. Okay, and this is a reference that is mentioned over here with the sound of the pistol shot in the street outside. There's some kind of a gunshot in the street outside. Everyone gets startled. Everyone gets straightened up because of the gun sound. "Dear, there's more to cars," said Miss Pym, going to the window to look and coming back and smiling apologetically with her hands full of sweet peas, as in those motor cars, those tires of motor cars, were all her fault. The violent explosion which made Mrs. Dalloway jump and Miss Pym go to the window and apologize came from a motor car which had drawn to the side of a pavement precisely opposite Mulberry's shop window. So it was a perfectly normal accident, it was a perfectly machining accident in the metropolis. But then the violent explosion reminds them of other serious and more sinister explosions which had happened during the war. So this is a déjà vu, a trigger which is constantly created, which can constantly be created by any kind of sound in the post-war metropolis. And that's what I meant when I said the war is there as a spectral presence. It's never really away from the minds of people, to such an extent that any sound, any noise which reminds them of any explosion, it only triggers these traumatic memories in the minds. Everyone starts, everyone jumps up in fear whenever a similar kind of sound is heard, a violent explosion. So passers-by, who of course stopped and stayed, had just time to see a face of the very greatest importance against a dove grey upholstery before a male hand drew the blind, and there was nothing to be seen except a square of dove grey. So someone of some eminence was passing by. It could be a minister, it could be a person from the royalty, but someone was in the car, and a passers-by could just see a glimpse of the person from inside the window. And there was just one little moment where a male hand drew the blind, and there was nothing to be seen except a square of dove grey. Right? So again, the visual narrative or the visual grammar over here is very, very cinematic. There's a certain close-up, an accelerated close-up on a particular person's facial features to indicate the persona, to indicate the character, the person who is there. But it's never quite mentioned who is the person. So the entire representation is very metonymic in quality, very fragmented in quality. Okay, so that's something which we see. Yet rumours were at once in circulation from the middle of Bond Street to Oxford Street on one side, to Atkinson's Scent shop on the other, passing invisibly, inaudibly like a cloud, swift, veil-like upon hills, falling indeed with something of a cloud's sudden sobriety and stillness upon faces which a second before had been utterly disorderly. But now mystery had brushed them with the wing. They had heard the voice of authority. The spirit of religion was abroad with its eyes bandaged tight and her lips gaping wide. But nobody knew whose face had been seen. Was it the Prince of Wales, the Queens, the Prime Ministers? Whose face was it? Nobody knew. So again, this is the very contagious quality of gossip, very contagious quality of rumors which are in circulation. They just spreads like clouds across vales and hills. So it's almost like a Wordsworthian quality about how rumors spread across the city. So there was a talk about people seeing someone of importance, but no one quite knew who exactly the person was. So, and there was all kinds of speculations made. Was it a Prince of Wales? Was it a Queen's face? Was it a Prime Minister's face? Nobody knew. Edgar J. A white wet case with his roll of lead piping around his arm said audibly, humorously of course, the Prime Minister's car. So again, the accent is important, the Prime Minister's car. It's almost like a Cockney accent that has been parodied over here. And now we come to the other important character in Mrs. Dalloway, and that is Septimus Smith. Septimus Warren Smith. So someone who's been a war veteran, who's come back from the war, and now obviously completely enervated by the trauma of war, someone who suffers shell shock, so to say, and most importantly, someone who feels like an outsider to the metropolis as well as to the people treating him in medical science. So no one in medical science knows what's the problem with Septimus Smith. So he becomes the unaccommodated man, the abandoned man to a certain extent. So the first reference to Septimus Smith obviously reflects his condition. Septimus Warren Smith, aged about 30, pale face, beak nose, wearing brown shoes and a shabby overcoat, with hazel eyes which had a look of apprehension in them which makes complete strangers apprehensive too. The world has raised its whip, where will it descend? So he obviously, there's a look of apprehension in his face all the time which makes other people looking at him apprehensive as well. So presumably he suffers from post-trauma anxiety. There's always this anxious look in his face, this anxiety embodied by him, and that is something which we are told over and over again. So he is someone who is suffering trauma, the trauma of war, the violence of war is sort of suffering over and over again, and that anxiety is showing spectacularly in his face. So Septimus also found himself unable to pass. It was almost like a crowd of people. Now what's interesting is to see how, despite the fact that Mrs. Dalloway and Septimus never get to meet each other in this novel, the paths crisscross all the time. In the same way, the narratives crisscross all the time. So the characters in each narrative sometimes inhabit the character in someone else's narrative. And only at the end of the novel do we find Clarissa Dalloway having some degree of empathetic gaze at Septimus when Septimus kills himself and jumping from a window and his broken body is carried over by an ambulance. Clarissa Dalloway hears the ambulance's siren and feels sorry for the person inside. So that establishes an empathy between the two characters because both are equally repressed. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this fiction, this particular novel, it's very uncanny, the similarity that was there between the shell-shocked male soldier and a quote-unquote hysteric woman who was confined to her bedroom, who was confined to a house, who was forcibly fed a particular diet to be strong and nervous again. How there's important, there's a degree of overlap, medical, existential overlap, experiential overlap with the shell-shocked soldiers whom nobody seemed to understand, nobody seemed to have any clue about what really happened to them. So in that sense, they too are abandoned, they too are unaccommodated, they too are misunderstood. And this degree of being abandoned, unaccommodated and misunderstood is something which connects Septimus Smith and Mrs. Dalloway at a very experiential and existential level. So we told this should be on screen. Everything had come to a standstill. The throb of the motor engine sounded like a pulse irregularly drumming through an entire body. So if you remember Wasteland, the fire sermon, we have this image of the taxi throbbing, waiting. So again, the machines becoming more human-like and humans becoming more machine-like. And this is exactly what happened to Mrs. Dalloway as well. The machines are becoming more and more humanized. They move with like almost human motor movements, whereas the human motor movements are getting more and more numbed. There's any degree of sensation left. There's very little sensation left, very little cognition left. So the human nerves are drying up. So the entirety of Mrs. Dalloway is about a nervous condition. And this obviously connects to George C. Mell's argument of modernity being a nervous condition, as I may have mentioned already. Okay, so the throb of the motor engine sounded like a pulse irregularly drumming through an entire body. The sun became extraordinarily hot because the motor car had stopped outside the Mulberry's shop window. Old ladies at the tops of omnibuses spread their black parasols, here a green, here a red parasol, open with a little pop. Mrs. Dalloway, coming to the window with arms full of sweet peas, looked out with a little pink face, pursued an inquiry. Everyone looked at the motor car. Septimus looked. boys and bicycles sprang off, traffic accumulated, and there was the motor car stood, and there the motor car stood with drawn blinds, and upon them a curious pattern like a tree, Septimus thought, and this gradual drawing together of everything into one center became before his eyes, as if some horror had almost come to the surface and was about to burst into flames, terrified him. The world wavered and quivered and threatened to burst into flames. It is I who am blocking the way, he thought. Was he not being looked at and pointed at? Was he not weight there, rooted to the pavement for a purpose, but for what purpose? Now, obviously, the last bit is the very, very clear depiction of the purposelessness that Septimus Smith suffered. There's no purpose in his life. He's just come back from the war, and we're also told that he's just back from the war, so he experienced a sense of enervation, a sense of liquidation. Everything's being liquidated. His sense has been shut down, essentially. There's no empathy left as such. And the lack of empathy is interesting because that empathy is what enervates them completely, right? And that also includes, informs his purposelessness to a certain extent. So the whole idea of rooted to the pavement, for what purpose, for what purpose, and the question comes again, for a purpose, but what purpose, right? So the purposelessness is important for us to understand over here, okay? And that's something which we need to pay some attention to. Okay, so the whole idea of purposelessness is important for us to understand because, you know, here we have a man who once had a lot of purpose, who once was presumably patriotic, went to the war, fought for the war, got involved in this very hyper-masculinist machinery of violence. And others back from the war, he finds himself complete directionlessness. So the complete directionless quality of Septimus, the purposeless quality of Septimus is what is being emphasized over and over again. He doesn't have anything to look forward to. So in that sense, it becomes a very perversely timeless man. So in a sense, the time has left him. He doesn't have a past. All his past is traumatic, and things of his past, everything is traumatic for him. The present is very, very fragile for him, and he doesn't have a future. There's no integration possible for him in this post-war metropolis. So that becomes an important situation for us to understand. Okay, so let us go on. Septimus said his wife, a little woman with large eyes and a sallow, pointed face, an Italian girl. So it's also important to see how many white British men over here, they end up marrying non-British women. So Septimus over here is married to an Italian girl. And it's interesting because Italy was not really an ally of England in the First World War. So that relationship that they have, and the marital relationship he develops with this girl, and obviously they end up marrying each other, is important against the political sort of context in which this novel is written. And her name is Lucrezia. But Lucrezia herself could not help looking at the motor car and the tree pattern on the blinds. Was it the Queen in there, the Queen going shopping? The chauffeur who had been opening something, turned something, shutting something, got onto the box. Come on, said Lucrezia. But her husband, for they had been married for 4 or 5 years now, jumped, started and said, all right, angrily, as if she had interrupted him, right? So this very jumpy quality about Septimus, this very edgy quality about Septimus is interesting because he's a very fragile person. His entire cognitive system, his entire nervous system is sort of informed by fragility. And that fragility obviously comes from a trauma, and this constant trauma and repression that is suffered in the war. And obviously the trench trauma is important for us to understand because, you know, a lot of the shell shock medical condition actually emerged from the trenches. Sometimes it was not really about getting hit by a shell or getting hit by any artillery bombing. It was just the entire experience of being in a very claustrophobic space of the trench and waiting for a bomb to come. And that wait for a bomb to come, the wait for a violence to come in a very claustrophobic closed space, that in a way generated the trauma. So in that sense, the close confines of the trenches and the close confines of the domestic house, that sort of connected the shell-shocked male soldier and a Victorian hysteric woman. And they seem to have a degree of empathy with each other in this particular novel as well, because Clarissa Dalloway is also a very, very confined woman. It's also someone who doesn't really have a lot of agency, apart from the superficial shopping that she does. And Septimus too, obviously, as we've just seen, is a purposeless, directionless man. So in that sense, there's a degree of empathy they have for each other, although they never meet in this novel. And that's an interesting crisscrossing that we see Woolf performing. Okay. People must notice, people must see, people, she thought, looking at the crowd, staring at the motor car, the English people with the children and the horses and the clothes, which she admired in a way. But they were people now, because Septimus had said, I will kill myself, an awful thing to say. Suppose they heard him. She looked at the crowd. Help, help, she wanted to cry out to the butchers, boys and women, help. Only last autumn, she and Septimus had stood on the embankment, wrapped in the same cloak, and Septimus, reading a paper, instead of talking, she had snatched it from him and laughed in the old man's face, and who saw them. But failure one conceals. She must take him away into some park. So the whole idea of Septimus, the transition that Septimus has from being a warrior, from being a war hero, to someone who's shivering, someone who's a nervous wreck now, is something which is suffered by Lucrezia and her wife, his wife. And this romantic past, this very, very interestingly glorified past, is constantly contrasted with a very innovative and fragile present that Septimus inhabits now. Now we will cross, she said. She had a right to his arm, although it was without feeling. He would give her who was so simple, so impulsive, only 24, without friends in England, and who had left Italy for his sake, a piece of bone. Right? So again, we have another example of an alienated person. So Lucrezia, who's an Italian woman Septimus is married to, she finds herself completely homeless in London. She doesn't know anyone, she can't connect to anyone. And as I mentioned, the political context is interesting because Italy was not an ally of England at that point in time, and you have an English soldier marrying an Italian woman and bringing her back to London, and that becomes very interesting. It so undercuts the political alliances at that point in time, which obviously shows how human relationships are formed despite the political relationships, and how the political relationships ended up consuming the human relationships, in the case of Septimus, consuming him quite biologically. Right? Now, the one phrase which keeps coming over and over again is without feeling. And the feelinglessness of Septimus is important because it's almost like a cognitive condition. He loses his whole idea of attachment, the whole ability to attach to things is gone because of his traumatic experience. He cannot empathize with things, he cannot feel things. So he becomes essentially a blank sheet, a completely emptied out person, cognitively speaking. And this is obviously a neural situation, a medical situation, but also a very deep and dark existential situation. And this medical existential trauma of Septimus is interesting because that generates a feelinglessness. That generates this inability to connect to people at a level of empathy, a level of imagination. It becomes more and more inward-looking, more and more introspective. And the introspective, inward-looking self begins to cannibalize itself in a way that it takes away, it eats up all his feelings. So he consumes himself in that sense. So the violence of war is not just the physical violence of people dying in the war, and we have examples of people referred to Septimus's own friends having died in the war, which in turn gives him survivor's guilt for having not died, and his friends have died. That gives him survivor's guilt, which adds to his trauma. So it's not just about that violence of dying in the war, but it's also this endless process of dying which happens post-war, and that makes it more painful for Septimus. And we see how the entire city of London is trying very hard and almost making a very compulsive and neurotic attempt to move on from the war. Everyone's busy shopping, train parties, looking very happy, etc. And that becomes a very compulsive, neurotic condition to very quickly move on in a very heavy-handed way from the war, and he gets left behind. So again, in that sense, as I just mentioned, it becomes very perversely timeless. Right? Not in a positive sense of timelessness, but being left behind by time, being abandoned by time. Right? So everyone's moving on very quickly, and it can't move on because it can't connect to things. Right? And that becomes part of the problem, part of the trauma, part of the existential alienation that it faces as a human subject. Okay, so the whole idea of being unaccommodated, the whole idea of being alienated, gets more and more, gets replayed at so many levels. Peter Walsh comes back from India. He cannot connect to London anymore because he spent a lot of time in India, in the colonies. He's married to an Anglo-Indian woman who Clarissa Dalloway hates because of her racial miscegenation. Septimus, coming back from the war, cannot come to London, which is very quickly trying to move on as a celebratory metropolis, hiding his mourning status, cannot connect. He, as a war hero, he comes back and completely feels alienated from the civilian life. Lucrezia, who's an Italian by birth, who's linguistically cut out from London, who is culturally cut out from London, who cannot connect to any part of London at all. So we have all different degrees of disconnect embodied by different people. And of course, Clarissa Dalloway, who was very much part of the mainstream upper-class British gentility, but he feels completely alienated because all she has is superficial markers of connect, like shopping, train parties, etc. There's no real human organic connect that she has. So this constant drama of disconnect, which Mrs. Dalloway keeps playing over and over again by portraying several characters, is what makes it such a complex novel, especially given the backdrop of the First World War, which is there as some kind of a spectral presence, a hauntological presence, if you will. It is there as well as not there. It's not been talked about, but everyone has lost something in the war, someone in the war. Everyone's secretly mourning, although trying to look very, very happy. So that ontological spectral presence of the war is something which must or can never be overlooked in the way that Woolf presents this novel. So we continue with this discussion in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.